I have an app on my phone. It's called Ever Accountable. It's there to monitor me. In fact, it monitors everything I do online. It's also on my laptop. It's watching me. I can't see it, but I know it's there because I'm the one that installed it. Now, it's not perfect. It doesn't have God-like abilities, but it's good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, and here's why. When I installed it years ago, part of the installation process was that I was required to pick a person who the app would then notify if it flagged anything that I was doing that was inappropriate. That's the app's genius. It involves a friend who knows me, who cares about me, who will check up on me. So when I'm browsing online, I know the app is watching, and it will notify my friend. Therefore, I am much more motivated to say no to temptation, and I'm glad for that. But I also have to admit to you, I don't like it. Why do I need accountability? I can tell myself I don't need it, or that I shouldn't need it. Years ago, I was on the other side of that equation, where I was the accountability partner for another guy. He'd actually been going to a counselor for many months to seek help for an addiction. And a couple of years into our accountability relationship, he divulged to me at one of our regular meetings that he and his counselor had discussed our accountability partnership recently, and they decided he didn't need it anymore. But not because he was healed, not because he had overcome or had experienced victory and this was no longer going to be a problem for the rest of his life. He said he didn't need me to hold him accountable because he believed that the accountability was hurtful to him. It was actually holding him back, he said. He said his accountability was actually detrimental to his spiritual growth. We need to be free in Christ, he said. In other words, when we are so in love with Jesus, we shouldn't need human accountability. How do you feel about that? I hear some truth in that, actually. There is an ancient Christian who famously said this: love God and do what you please. If you love God, you'll only do what God loves. That's the argument. It's a rational argument. It's valid. So therefore, if you love God, you won't need accountability. Right? How likely is that to happen? How likely is it that we would be such strong disciples of Jesus, so thoroughly loving God, that we will always do what God would do in a given situation? Unlikely. Right? And so perhaps accountability might actually be a good thing. Perhaps accountability is actually realistic because of what we know of human nature. Perhaps accountability is actually a good thing because of what we've talked about the previous 2 Sundays. The need to encourage one another. The need to be meeting together. To build one another up. We need each other. That's the emphasis behind this whole sermon series on relationships in the church. That the beauty of being in a community together called a church family is a willingness to be there for each other, to help one another, and perhaps to hold one another accountable. So what does the Bible say about accountability? Like Kurt talked with us about. There is that famous passage of Scripture in Matthew chapter 7. Do not judge, or many of you maybe remember it in the King James. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, you can turn there. It's page 788 in your pew Bibles. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, page 788. Matthew chapters 5 through 7 all together are what are famously called Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And throughout that sermon, Jesus gives a powerful description of what a kingdom-minded heart looks like in the life of one of his followers. And he goes through all sorts of areas to show how we will actually live if our hearts and minds are so transformed by Jesus. So here in chapter 7, verse 1, Jesus preached these words, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." So as a result, we followers of Jesus have a just cause to avoid behaviors or attitudes that could be described as judging. We shouldn't be judgmental people. Jesus is particularly concerned as we continue in the passage, and he talks about looking at the person that has like a little speck, little tiny piece of dust in their eye, when we have a log in our own. And so he's really concerned about judgmental people who have these attitudes towards others when they themselves are filled with all kinds of issues. It's kind of like that phrase, well, isn't that the pot calling the kettle black? Have you heard that one? You maybe even use that phrase, or others that are like it. No, those who live in glass houses should not be picking up stones to throw. Some have interpreted Jesus as meaning that his followers should never make any judgments against other people. Is that what Jesus intended here? Over the years in this church family, our church family, this has been a concern. It's come out. Very similar to what Kirk mentioned in his churches. The first occasion that I remember was probably 20 years ago. Our denomination actually has a guideline that, and I'm going to really summarize it here because I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, but the guideline from the denomination is that our church leadership teams, any local church leadership team, is instructed to examine the members of the congregation before we hold communion to see if there is an issue that might prohibit anyone from taking communion. Now, historically, our denomination practiced quarterly communion, and that's what Faith Church was doing 20 years ago. Now, we've since changed, as you well know, and we take communion every month. But even with only quarterly communion, can you imagine this? Even with only quarterly communion, 4 times a year, Faith Church's leaders were not doing what the denomination asked us to do. And so we talked about it. Should we start this up? How would we do this? Can you imagine? Bring people into the office one by one, turn the lights out, put on a little examination light, strap them to a lie detector test, and then say, "Tell me, what's been going on in your life?" Or maybe what we should do is every Sunday morning before we have communion, set out a confessional booth like they do in the Catholic Church. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, the denomination really has that? Examine every member? This is bonkers. It's in there. There's even a longer history to it. In fact, our denomination was started right here in Lancaster County. It's a tile maker from Ephrata named Jacob Albright. You know Albright College in Reading? Same name. It's who it's named for. Well, he committed his life to Jesus, and he ended up joining a Methodist class meeting. Class meeting is just a title that they called essentially a house church or a small group. And at the beginning of those Methodist class meetings, they would ask a question every single time. How goes it with your soul? And then the people around the room, around these tables where they're having a fellowship meal together, they would answer the question, how's it going with your soul? They would bare their soul to one another. They would confess their sins to one another. This was an accountability measure. But we got away from that. Over the years, into the 1800s, early 1900s, churches became institutionalized. There was no more confession, no more accountability. Maybe they looked at it and they kind of thought, oh, that's what the Catholics do, and we're not the Catholics. At some point, though, our denomination thought that each local church should still practice something of this. And that led to our church leadership team talking about it, that every person should be examined before they take communion. Now, I distinctly remember being in the meeting back in our conference room where we talked about this. The heart behind it is a good idea for discipleship. God doesn't want us to have sin in our lives. It's in our best interest not to have sin in our lives and not to have sin in the church, right? So an examination like that has the intent of love and care, spiritual growth for everyone in the church. It's a desire for healthy accountability. It's great, right? To be that kind of caring and loving for one another. Accountability that encourages discipleship is wonderful, right? Yes, but also no. We weren't going to do any lie detector interrogations. We weren't going to set up a confessional booth in the lobby. We weren't going to require everyone to sit around the sanctuary and one by one answer, "How goes it with your soul?" What we did talk about was an idea where maybe in a confidential meeting, just the leadership team, we would get out like the church phone directory or a list of everybody in the church, and we would just go down name by name. Is there anyone that has any legitimate concerns? And discuss it amongst ourselves. And if there was a legitimate concern, such that a person should not take communion, then maybe one or two members of the leadership team would go and have a private meeting with that person. This is an awesome idea, right? That idea went over like a lead balloon. Why? Because numerous members of the leadership team said that they felt deeply uncomfortable judging another person's spirituality. They mentioned Matthew 7. Judge not, or you will be judged. And they said they were sinners too. They had no right judging someone else's spirituality. And with that, the idea died. Then a couple years later, it came back to life. In a very, very different arena of our church. In 2013, we were working on a process making a significant change to who could become leaders in the church. And prior to 2013, some of you might remember this, we had a system where we'd have our annual congregational meeting in November, and people were voted onto our various serve teams. At the time, we called them commissions, but they're what are our serve teams today. Then, after the first of the year, the serve team would get together, all the 7 serve teams, and they each would have to choose who would represent their serve team onto what was then called the ministry council. Now, there's no doubt about it. There were times when the leaders rose to the top. But there were also times when serve team members would be sitting around those tables in their meeting. They'd be staring down, not wanting to look each other in the eye, not wanting to give any indication that they might be a candidate to represent their team to the ministry council. Representing your team to the ministry council meant going to one more meeting. It meant more responsibility, and who wants that? And so these meetings would drag on where no one would sign up. They had to make a decision. Someone had to be the representative of their serve team to the ministry council. And so deals were brokered. Some of you remember this. I'll go to the leaders, or I'll go to the ministry council if you chair the serve team. Deals are not the way we choose leaders in the church. And what that meant was that sometimes people were on ministry council who did not really want to be on ministry council and who might not have been qualified. This was a very poor way to select leaders in the church. Not to mention, that kind of leadership selection had no basis in biblical teaching. And so we proposed a change to our bylaws, a proposal that would do away with that system, and it would elect people directly onto the leadership team, people who had clearly demonstrated that they were spiritually mature, which is the biblical principle for selecting leaders in the church. And there would be a process, and it would be led by the nominating committee, and that nominating committee would be very intentional that they would only nominate people who were demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt for many years that they were spiritually mature. And then, after the leadership team had been voted on by the congregation at the annual meeting, the leadership team would decide which of its members would be liaisons to the various serve teams. Well, again, this idea was called into question. Who are we to judge a person's spiritual maturity? Who is the nominating committee to judge a person's spiritual maturity? Wouldn't it be wrong to make judgments? Jesus said, do not judge. Or did he? I mean, yes, we just read it. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Judge not, or you will be judged. But quite frankly, Jesus puts us in a little bit of a difficult position there because, as Kirk referred to, there are other passages that really seem to ask us to make some judgments. For example, if you just look a few verses later in Matthew chapter 7, look at verses 15 to 20. What does Jesus say? By their fruits you will know them. Wait a minute, Jesus. You just said, judge not. But now you're saying, by their fruits you will know them? Don't you have to make a judgment call in order to know them by their fruits? Are you contradicting yourself, Jesus? Well, in this passage, in verses 15 through 20, Jesus is talking about false prophets that could perhaps worm their way into the church. And so he's saying that people will need to make an examination about their fruits and make a decision about them. That implies a judgment call. Maybe making judgments is acceptable in some situations. And this is not just about determining whether or not a person is to be a leader in the local church. This is what we are talking about today. This is vital for the idea of holding one another accountable in a church family. And this is why Paul will go on to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 12, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked man from among you. What Paul is saying here is often so radically different than what we do in our typical day and age. For too long in the United States of America, Christians have been very judgmental about what happens outside the church and government and culture and so on. And Paul very clearly says, what business is of mine is to judge what happens outside the church? Paul is saying, let your focus be on what is inside the church and do make a judgment call. This passage is not about selecting leaders. Paul explains the situation that he was talking about earlier in the chapter is actually people in the church were being sexually immoral. And the Corinthian believers were not dealing with it. You can hear the Corinthian believers say, well, I don't want to judge. Well, Jesus said, don't judge. Who am I? I'm a sinner too. Paul says, no. You need to deal with sin in the church. Hold them accountable. And he'll go on in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 to say specifically, churches should even appoint people to the work of judging disputes between believers. And so here we have at least two different kinds of situations in which judging was not only encouraged, but it was described by Paul as necessary. And so we can conclude that there is a way to mesh Jesus' teaching that says do not judge with what the early church experienced about how to live that out in real life. Paul understood Jesus as not banning all forms of judging, but instead as teaching a general principle that is wise in most situations. But there will be those situations where judging is not only permissible but important. And you might respond that these passages they're not really talking about holding people accountable. We didn't ever hear the word accountability, but we did read the important principle that undergirds accountability. That of making an evaluation of someone else's spirituality as Scary or iffy as that might feel, and it should feel scary and iffy. We should have a sense of teachability and caution and humility about it. But we learn from Jesus, by their fruits you will know them. We are to examine the fruits, the produce, the product that is coming out of a person's life. So what is it? When we look around, do we see the fruit of the Spirit like we have been focusing on in our church for many months? We have to make an evaluation. We have to look for those fruits. Do we see them? What do we see? That evaluation is not judgmental. It is simply a factual evaluation. And it could be that we observe the fruit of the Spirit. But it could be that we observe rotten fruit. Sinful, selfish, greedy, lustful, lack of self-control, like we've been talking about today. You might think, Joel, that sounds like the Gestapo sneaking around the church, or some Hitler Youth kind of experiment where kids have to report on their parents. It's not like that at all. What I'm talking about, what Jesus was talking about, what Paul was talking about, is very simply real life. We are regularly interacting with one another. That's the normal part of having a relationship. That's the normal part of being in a church family. We're rubbing shoulders with one another. And Jesus and Paul are basically just saying, don't ignore it. Don't act as though bad fruit isn't happening when you're seeing it in the life of the church family, when you're experiencing it in the life of your church family. Open our eyes, see it, and respond to it. That's accountability. Responding in love to those in the church family who have sinned, who might be struggling with sin, who might be in danger of sinning. Accountability is about making an evaluation of their lives out of love for them, so that we can lovingly and graciously point them to Jesus. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus will talk about this in verses 15 through 17. You can flip ahead. I'm going to read it for you. It says, "If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. Treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector." Do you notice the 3-step accountability process that Jesus uses in this teaching? It can be hard to follow the 3-step process. I've experienced numerous times over the years, people just simply ignore the process. Instead of Jesus' 3-step accountability process, where you first of all follow step 1 and go to the person, sometimes skip over and start talking to other people about that person. Why? Because it can be so difficult to hold people accountable. I get that. It's hard. It's hard for me too. It's easy to just want to avoid it. I hate confrontation. How many of you, I'm sure there could be a lot of hands raised, hate confrontation? I think it's normal to hate confrontation. Even those people who do not avoid confrontation, and you might think to yourself, wow, they're so good at confrontation. They seem like they're really able to do it well. Usually if you ask them, they'll say they don't like it either. It's not fun. But when people give in to fear about confrontation, often what they do is they got to get it out. They got to talk about it. And so instead of talking to the person who they need to talk to, they talk to all these other people. I've had people come to me as pastor and express their concerns about another person, hoping that I will intervene on their behalf. And quite frankly, I have sometimes, and that was wrong of me. If you've come to me and said, Pastor Joel, I'm concerned about such and such a person, and I say to you, okay, I'll take care of it, you should stop me in my tracks right away and say no. I'm giving in to my people-pleasing tendency when I do that, which is actually a way of avoiding holding someone accountable. So I should be saying, no, you first need to go to that person and follow what Jesus says in Matthew. What's really going on when you avoid holding someone accountable and then you go to someone else and talk about that person is three things. Number one, you're avoiding doing what Jesus taught. Number two, it's more than likely meaning that you're gossiping. And number three, you're then placing that third person in a position where now they need to confront you because you didn't go and talk to the first person. That's 3 strikes. Just avoid all of that. And I know it's not easy. It's very difficult for me too. By simply doing what Jesus said. Lovingly, graciously, talking to the person. And then, of course, Jesus says there's 2 other steps as well. Because sometimes when you go one-on-one and talk to someone, it doesn't work out. And that's when then, step 2, you can bring someone with you. Step 3, if it still doesn't work out, you can take it to the church. And by that, I think the clearest thing is not to stand up in a worship service on a Sunday morning, but maybe take it to the leadership team or something like that. But when you hold someone accountable, do so with gracious love. Paul writes this in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. He says, "Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Each one should test his own actions. Then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else, for each one should carry his own load." What Paul is saying here is that we should not bulldoze people when we confront them. Some people have that kind of strong personality. They might believe they're good at confronting because they're not afraid to do it. They might see themselves as someone who's good at speaking their mind. Frankly, they might take pride in it. It might feel good to them. And they might leave carnage from all that bulldozing. Paul says that accountability should be done gently, towards restoration. And not everybody's good at that. Don't assume that you're good at it. Instead, pursue gentleness, another one of the fruits of the Spirit. Pursue restoration and reconciliation. Remembering what Paul taught in Ephesians 4:15, speaking the truth in love. So in conclusion, I think there is a reactive accountability and a proactive accountability. For the most part, what I've been talking about are those passages that talk about a reactive accountability. A person sins, there's a brokenness, something's wrong, and we react to it. We want to restore them lovingly, graciously, with gentleness. But accountability can also be very, very powerful in the proactive sense. Proactive accountability is when a person volunteers to submit themselves to accountability because they desire it. It could be, like I said at the beginning, that you maybe place accountability software on your devices. It could be that you meet with an accountability partner or maybe in a small group and maybe you ask that question, how goes it with your soul? And you confess your sins one to another. My accountability partner's name is Chris. We met in the dorm in college. If you've been here at Faith Church over the years, you've heard me talk about him before. Chris was my RA, resident assistant. He was in charge of my dorm section. And we started meeting weekly my sophomore year. We wrote out questions that we wanted each other to ask. Those areas where we wanted each other to hold us accountable. And we would meet each week. We would work down through the list of questions. How are you doing with this? Or how are you doing with that? It could be financial. It could be relational. It could be thought life. It could be devotions. And we would then finish the time together in prayer. We both graduated in 1996, and we have continued to meet ever since. Now, we don't have that sheet of questions anymore, but we do have wide-ranging, honest discussions about our lives. They've changed significantly over 30 years. Marriage, parenting, job changes, health changes. We still meet every couple of months or so in person, and then we have tons of texting or phone calls in between there. I have found this accountability, this friendship to be incredibly encouraging to my spiritual life. Now, certainly family members are almost like this kind of built-in natural accountability as well. You know how it can work in families sometimes, right? You're spending more time with your siblings, your spouses, your parents than anybody else. You know that phrase in Scripture, iron sharpens iron? That's family sometimes, and the iron sharpening iron process can get a little hot. But it's natural built-in accountability. It's not always easy. Oftentimes we push hard against it, especially when it comes to our families, because we don't want our family members to confront us or hold us accountable. And yet it can be a very, very helpful thing. That's sometimes both reactive and proactive accountability. It can also happen in the life of a church family, where we nurture humble, teachable hearts with one another, because that humility is the raw material that accountability can use to do its good work in our lives. I was listening recently to a podcast where a gentleman was talking about how he and his family so deeply wanted to be in an accountable community that they were willing to submit even their major financial decisions to this small group of friends who were holding one another accountable. And the way it worked for them was every expenditure over $1,000 went before the group of friends for a discerning process. And they made a decision. And they entrusted the final decision to that small group. That's some wild, proactive accountability, and yet maybe very, very good. In our society, we tend to believe that people who aren't good with their money are the ones that need accountability. And we believe that those who are good with their money have developed the right habits about money, and they don't need to be held accountable. And what this means is that people with very little money have accountability, but not the rest of us. Well, that seems wrong to me. It seems to me that disciples of Jesus, who are stewards of Jesus' money, would be wise to submit themselves to financial accountability, especially if they have a lot of money. Simply because they are the stewards of so much of that money, perhaps they shouldn't be handling it alone. It seems to me also in the area of our culture, especially our online culture, where it is so easy to access things on the internet, that we would be wise to submit ourselves to internet accountability on our devices. It seems to me that we would be wise to submit ourselves to accountability among a group, maybe a small group. To answer that question, how goes it with your soul? So who's holding you accountable? I think all of us should be able to answer that question. It's not judging. It's loving, gracious, encouragement, building one another up as disciples of Jesus for the kingdom and his mission.